I just bought a small business, and in this video I'm going to go over every step in the process and how I got there. Let's begin. Step 1 was committing in the first place. Many months ago now, I decided to go on this venture of trying to buy a small business. And that's mainly because I wanted to increase my cash flow position, and I saw investing in a small business as a great way to do that, at least compared to things like investing in public stocks and real estate. After doing some preliminary research, I noticed that businesses were often selling for a couple times their annual free cash flow compared to public stocks, which might be trading for 10, 20, or even 30 times their free cash flow. In short, they looked pretty cheap relative to the cash flow you could get. But when you invest in 100% of a small business, you are taking over the thing, so you're going to have to run it, so there's some effort involved. But I decided, based on where I'm at in my investing career, I should be focusing far more on the offense versus defense when it comes to investing. And the offense would be producing new income. I've talked about the whole offense versus defense thing at length in other videos, so let's move on. After committing, there's step 2, which is looking at businesses. I looked at business listings for about 6 months before I ended up closing on one, so I did look at quite a few, and I wasn't doing this on a full-time basis by any means, but I did spend quite a bit of time over those months looking at various different types of companies and figuring out what kind of business I should go for. I looked at businesses in all sorts of different niches, including glass blowing, ice cream, and a bunch of other things. And I eventually decided to narrow my focus on a service-based business and eventually ended up in the cleaning space. That's because I wanted a business that was simple enough for me to understand even as a beginner and was still scalable because the service could be repeated across many different customers. And the business I ended up buying was a carpet and steam cleaning business. But how did I find businesses to look at in the first place? Well, I found a lot of them through sites like BizBuySell, which is a big national listing service that shows you all sorts of different businesses for sale. They'll typically list their revenue and some sort of cash flow, although the cash flow number is often very adjusted, so you might have to ask for more info, but that would often be the next step. I would reach out if I was interested in a business to ask for more information, typically more detailed financial information or anything that might be relevant to that business. And it was usually at this time that the listing agent would have me sign something called an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement, meaning that I couldn't take the information that they give me and then go share it with a bunch of other people. And during this time, they would also typically ask about my ability to purchase the thing, what's my net worth potentially, how much money do I have to invest. This typically would be a pretty lax process, but they would ask nonetheless. They're just trying to avoid giving out sensitive business information to just anyone. But from there, I'd usually get some more information on the business, usually a couple of years of financials and some more data that might be helpful to look at. And then if I'm still interested in the business, I might take some time to call the listing agent or whoever was selling the thing and ask them a bit more about the business from there. Now, I heard about the company that I ended up closing on through an email. And this email was from a business broker that was part of a local office of a larger national chain of business brokers. And I got on their list because I asked about a different business that this company had listed on BizBuySell. And because I had asked, they put me into their email list. And at some point, the business that I bought ended up lowering their sales price a little bit. And when they did that, they sent out an email to everyone on their list. I was on that list, so I inquired about the company because it looked interesting. But that's how I initially heard about the listing. I got myself on a broker's email list. Now, the next step in the process was making an offer. I did this a few times with a few different businesses, and I only ended up getting one of my offers accepted, and it was for the business I ended up closing on. But this is your big chance to negotiate with the seller, not only on price, but maybe specific terms in the contract. Maybe there's a key person at this business that you really don't want to leave, so you might negotiate something like a key man provision, as it's often called, where they're not allowed to leave, or else you get some sort of clawback from the seller. But different terms are more appropriate for different businesses, so it really depends on what you're trying to go for and what the seller's trying to do as well. This is also a spot where you might try to negotiate something like seller financing, but we'll get to that in a second. But after you make an offer and do any negotiations, ideally the seller will accept your offer, and then we get to step number 4, which is getting under contract. And this is also paired up with the due diligence phase. Now, this was my chance to take a much more thorough look at the business. I did go and look at the business before I made an offer on it, but I wanted to get a more thorough look at certain things, like bringing someone out to take a look at the equipment, mainly the 2 vans that I was buying with this business, 2 work vans that had equipment in them. And I also asked for a lot more financial documents and proof of certain expenses to make sure I was getting what I was getting and trying to get as much data as I could before the due diligence period ended. I also asked for tax returns from the seller to make sure that all the numbers numbers lined up there too, because if they're lying to the government, then wow, that is a big red flag. But at least in my contract, we had a few extra conditions that were required prior to closing, including getting approval for a lease at the current location since we were switching ownership entities, so the landlord would have to approve that new entity. They weren't going to do a sublease. And also, as a condition of closing, I required having one of the employees sign an employment contract with me prior to closing, or at least approve the contract, so at closing we could sign it, and then I would be a little bit more protected from someone jumping ship right away, and then I'd have to scramble on the day or week of closing. The point is, whatever conditions you negotiate into the contract, this is your time to either verify things or get those conditions met. And you want to clear or at least uncover as many red flags as you possibly can. And this brings me to step number 5, which really is more alongside step number 4, and that is banking and entity setups. My business purchase was done through an LLC, which was actually owned by another LLC, which was newly formed at the time that I went under contract, so I had to set up a bunch of things prior to closing. So I had one LLC in place prior to going under contract, and that LLC was what did actually go under contract. But then, as we were getting close to ending due diligence, I opened up a new entity under the existing entity, so it's a subsidiary entity, and this was also an LLC. But anyways, this new LLC needed its own bank account as well, so that took a little time, and then I was transferring money from my personal name into the holding company LLC, then down to the subsidiary LLC, so it took some time to actually move money around, which became a bit of a problem at times, but nothing that actually stopped me from closing on this business. We just had to delay things a couple of weeks. And that wasn't the only reason we delayed closing a little bit. It was also getting the funding in the first place. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But because it was late December going into January, so around the holiday times, it was a little bit difficult to get things done quickly when it came to opening up accounts and moving money around. So that was a bit annoying. So keep that in mind if you happen to be trying to close around the holidays. The point is, you want to make sure you have whatever legal structure you're trying to use for the business set up prior to closing. And you also want to make sure that you can assign your right to any new entity that you want to use, assuming it's not ready prior to going under contract. So that's what I did here. I set up my new entity and then I assigned it from the holding company entity down to this new one. And the new one is what ended up buying the business. Now, also alongside steps 4 and 5 was step 6, which was funding. In this case, I used a combination of personal loans, cash, and also a credit card promo where it's 0% interest and I had to just pay a fee up front, which actually ended up being pretty useful for this deal. I went over all these terms in my previous net worth video, so if you're curious, go check that out. I'll link it above. But this technically was a cash purchase, meaning that the buying entity, the new LLC that I set up, was buying this in all cash. But I still did have a financing contingency in place in the contract, in that I had to get approved for enough debt to purchase the business, but that was all in my personal name, so it was a little bit awkward, but it worked out in that I had the right to cancel the contract in the event I didn't get enough debt to actually purchase the thing, but the buying LLC itself wasn't taking out the debt. But over a few weeks, I built up a pile of cash, moved that pile of cash into the new entity's bank account, and then I wired that money over to the escrow company that was facilitating the closing. Which brings me to step 7, closing. Once the escrow company had the money and all of the things it needed to close, it brought the seller and I together into one room for closing day, and we signed a bunch of documents. These included things like the title to the vehicles, it included the bill of sale, and a bunch of other closing documents needed to transfer ownership of all of the business assets over to my buying entity. And to clarify, I was buying the business assets, the business name, all of the stuff in the business, not the actual business entity that the seller was using. So it's two separate entities here. It wasn't a merger. So I wasn't inheriting the tax liabilities of the previous business. Instead, I was effectively starting fresh from a tax perspective, but I was getting all of the business assets that have already been running for quite some time. And the seller is subject to a non-compete in the local area, so they can't just go and start the same business next door and start soliciting all the clients that they allegedly just sold me. So that shouldn't be a threat. And if it does happen, it'll definitely be a lawsuit. But once we had closed, it was now time to start the fun part, which was step 8, transitioning. Now, immediately after closing on the same day, the seller and I spent quite a bit of time together transitioning over all the different accounts and many of the different things that the former company was billed for, moving those over to the new company. Even though it's the same business, it's a new ownership entity, so moving everything over to this new owner's name, which is the company that I own. But as a part of the contract, the seller has an obligation to train me or help me with the transition for at least 2 weeks. So I'm able to ask him a bunch of questions, or at least he's contractually obligated to help me out. And as of the filming of this video, he's been really helpful in that process. We're still in the middle of that transition phase and getting everything moved over. Or at this point, it's not so much moving things over, but more just getting used to the processes that were in place and looking for ways to potentially improve them. And And thankfully, there were already a number of jobs scheduled for the days after closing, so we had a nice way to sort of get used to the process in that we actually had real-world examples to use. Which brings us to step 9, now. So what I'm working on now is the future of the business. What am I going to be doing with it? Right now, I want to focus on growing this thing. There's definitely room for growth. Right now, the business is doing something around $300,000 in revenue, which comes out to something like $70,000 in cash flow. And that's with 2 full-time employees and 2 fully equipped vans. The business is underutilizing one of the 2 vans that I bought, in that typically only 1 van is being used in a given day, so you have some room for growth right there, assuming you can get enough demand by upping ad spend and getting more customers that way or by other means. And there's definitely some room to smooth out some of the processes, at least a little bit, though things are pretty well systematized. The previous owner did a pretty nice job in making things run pretty smoothly. But my number 1 priority with this business to help it grow would be to hire a general manager or really an operator for this business. And both before and after closing, I've been interviewing some really promising candidates to serve in that role. And this would be someone who would full-time work on the business, sort of like its COO, assuming this were some giant company, someone really in charge of operations and making sure that things are running smoothly and helping to implement a strategic vision. Right now, I'm still working as an attorney, so I would really like to have someone there full-time working on the business and helping it grow, and I would still be helping alongside, of course, but it'd be really great to have someone who already has experience with running and growing businesses and someone who can focus on that full-time. But I found some promising candidates already, so I'm optimistic that we're going to have someone in place as a general manager pretty soon, and that's going to really help drive growth for this business, assuming all goes well. But there you have it. Those were the steps I took in buying a business here in Houston, Texas. Definitely let me know if you have questions down below. Otherwise, I'm going to be doing a lot of content about this whole experience in running the business, in trying to grow it. Also, more content about buying the business and how to find one, because I don't think this will be my last deal, though time will tell. Either way, I'll definitely let you know what I learn along the way. Otherwise, be sure to subscribe, and until next time, take care.